So with the school admission season, I won't say coming up, happening and continuing into the next couple of weeks as well, especially for parents who are starting their journey with their child who is neurodivergent for the first time in school setting, what is an inclusion department or system in a school?
Admissions is something that I'm very much a part of. It's more about us as a school making sure that we can meet the needs of the student.
A lot of times it's just the fit,
Exactly.
right? You know, is this the right environment for my child? The school may be great, but may not be the right environment for your child at this point of time, and vice versa.
Yeah.
You know, should the school know the complete diagnosis and therapy that my child has? Does that reduce the opportunity for my child get into school as a parent?
I wouldn't say that it reduces the opportunity. I just think it delays the right support.
Sometimes for parents, it's just about let him start school and then we will deal with it in, you know, finding out what kind of supports he needs. If not, the whole process is completely blocked because this child has a diagnosis. And the second thing being that, what do we do when all the schools have rejected?
I think, you know, KHDA brought in a non-admission form for heads of inclusion, and we have to complete that non-admission form if we are saying to families that we don't have a space in our school.
Yes, so let's say if I'm first on the waiting list, but my child is a level 3 support, and there's somebody who's 10th on the waiting list, but their child is only level 1 support. So do you think there's a differentiation in, you know, the way the admission process works for?
I think it depends year by year, like year by year.
What is that as a parent that they should be aware of when during the interview they've been told that, you know, be ready to get an LSA in place?
It might differ from school to school, but when it comes to myself and how I approach learning support assistance is if I believe that the child won't be safe by themselves, I would suggest the LSA.
So as a parent, how often will I be involved?
As a parent with the child who's level 3, who has an IEP, you will be at school a lot, which is really nice.
Am I allowed to ask for certain things in the IEP?
You shouldn't really have to request it. It should be done naturally, really.
What does success actually look like for a neurodivergent child?
A happy child, a child that belongs, a child that can relate.
Does inclusion always mean mainstream schooling?
No, I don't think so.
What about AI?
I know that the education sector are doing a lot more work around AI and how we can use AI more for our students. The students love AI.
But what about things like the emotional safety, the regulation support, the sensory-friendly atmosphere they're providing, the flexibility, the collaborative culture? As a parent, how would I know this information?
On the website, you're going to find a lot of information, and especially if you look for any kind of inspection reports.
So my last question would be, what is the one thing which every parent of a child with additional needs or a neurodivergent child you wish truly understood? Hi, Ms. Regan. Very good morning. How are you doing today?
I'm really good, thank you. I've just been down to Kite Beach for a cycle, so I'm feeling energized and just so happy to be here with you today.
Such a pleasure to have you here. And more so because we've worked so closely over the last almost 4 years, and it's been a wonderful journey. And thank you so much for being here on the show as our guest. And we really look forward to learning a lot about the wonderful work that you do and the inclusion ecosystem you've created.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to having a conversation about inclusion and about my journey so far. There's lots to celebrate.
Amazing. So let's start off with telling us more about yourself and how, starting as a teacher, you've come all the way until now as the head of inclusion and getting into leadership very soon.
Well, I guess my journey started in London. Actually, even before that, I was born in South Africa and I studied to be a teacher in South Africa. I worked for 2 years in South Africa, but I was looking for something more. I wanted to learn more about differentiation and how to support all the learners in my class. At that point, South Africa didn't have that structure in the schools, so I was really blessed enough to be able to travel all the way to London, and I worked in London for 12 years before I came to Dubai. I was a class teacher for many, many years and worked in many different year groups in primary schools, 2 different primary schools in London. And I guess it just came naturally for me. It came naturally for me in the sense that I was always very determined to make sure that I met every single child where they were at on their learning journey. And I put everything I possibly could put in place to help those students. And the leadership that I was under at that point saw that, strengthened me, and they felt that I would have a bigger impact, not only on my class if I worked in more of a leadership role. And just to note as well, I was really blessed in the sense that I also had a lot of experience working as subject leaders. So like I was a math subject leader, I was a literacy subject leader. And I think that that knowledge of the curriculum was really important in having that as a foundation for inclusion, because you really understand the pathways that children are going along and what the expectations are of them. So then I was promoted to Senko, which is similar to Head of Inclusion back in London, and I was trained by a specialist Senko for a year. She came and worked with me every week for 2 days. We worked side by side, and she taught me everything I know, really. And it was then that I decided, I worked for many years in London as a Senko, and then I decided I wanted to come and work in Dubai, because from my understanding, Dubai was quite new to inclusion, and I really, really enjoy like development. So being part of a team that develops and improves systems in schools is something that I'm very passionate about. So I was lucky enough to interview, and I got the role as SEN teacher, almost 3.5 years ago. And I landed in Dubai in January and started my job, and I worked on the ground as a SEN teacher. And I think that looking back, that was really good for me, because I was able to really understand how the systems work here in Dubai. And I did a lot of like auditing, action planning, because I mean, at that point I knew I wanted to be head of inclusion. So I was planning ahead of what I wanted to do and in terms of changes and where I saw the gaps in the systems. So then I became a head of inclusion primary. And I worked as a head of inclusion primary for a year, and then I became head of inclusion whole school, and that's been my role for the last 2 years. And just recently I've been promoted to assistant principal, head of inclusion, because I've been doing a lot of work with compliance in the KHDA this year, and I think that that's really given me the skills to be able to work in that executive leadership team. So I would say that my journey's been steady, and it's been really rewarding, and I've had a lot of people along the way that have helped me. It hasn't been something I've done by myself, including you, actually.
Pleasure. So it's really an inspiring journey, to see where you've started along and the roles that you've played. And like you rightly said, I think the foundations that each step has given you to concretely lay towards what's the next. And so beautifully and elegantly you've taken up each role, and I've personally seen you grow through the last 3 to 4 years and the wonderful pathways that you've created. What would you say are some of the rewarding and also some of the most challenging types of, or obstacles that you've gone through this whole experience, more so towards inclusion?
I would say policy to practice. So I've got a lot of success stories, because I believe that policy lays a foundation for inclusion, that if we're all following the guidance from the KHDA, we're following the guidance because I work in a British school, the SEN Code of Conduct, and specifically the graduated approach. I'm a very big believer in that process. And just recently I was looking at my numbers of level 3 students, and the graduated approach works both ways, doesn't it? So you can use it to identify students where you can see that there might be barriers, you put in the right support in place, and sometimes that support looks like a learning support assistant, and sometimes it can be 100% learning support assistant. And then what we really try to do as slowly as we can is gradually reduce that support to 50%, then to no support, because ideally we want our students to be independent. there is a lot of, a lot of success in having that learning support assistant. But my main aim as a head of inclusion is to create independent learners, no matter what their needs are. So just recently, I was looking at my numbers for level 3 students next year, and we have 13 students who are going off level 3 support. And that for me is something of an achievement, meaning that, they're at all different parts of their journey, but for them that means a lot, and for their families, because I make sure our team works really hard at that, making sure that our students learn those skills, they can generalize them, and then they can do them for themselves. So that is definitely a success, and the graduated approach is something I really believe in. Challenges can sometimes be where we're not able to access the right support for the student. And there are many reasons why. It can be because parents aren't really ready for that journey, and we need to make sure we're meeting the parents on that journey, or financial challenges are massive here. And just to note, like if you compare back to London compared to here, the healthcare system funds a lot of that support that children get, as well as the local authorities. So I think that trying to find ways, it was a challenge, actually, the financial strain on families, but we've been trying to work this year, especially you and I guess, on how we can take away that financial challenge for families, because for parents to pay school fees as well as, all the additional costs, it really can put families in some really tough spots. And that's something I don't want for our families. Like, life is challenging as it is. We really don't need money or finances to be a challenge for them. Yeah.
True. And often being able to help families also decide what prioritizes for the child at that moment compared to, reallocating their finances into something else at a later point of time plays a very important role. Great. So with the school admission season, I won't say coming up, happening, and continuing into the next couple of weeks as well, especially for parents who are starting their journey with their child who is neurodivergent for the first time in school setting, can you elaborate a little more on what is an inclusion department or system in a school, and who is your team as the head of inclusion in school?
Admissions is something that I'm very much a part of. We've got like a great admissions team in school, and we've made sure that we have really, really strong systems in place. And I think that the most important part of admissions to note for parents especially is that it's more about us as a school making sure that we can meet the needs of the student. It's not about whether or not the student fits into the school, because I have a very big responsibility for that child's education. And I want to make sure that when they start, from the first day that they start in our school, that they are experiencing success and joy and happiness, because as you all know, our first experiences shape, the rest of our journey. So when it comes to admissions, most schools have got big teams that work on that, and it's quite multifaceted in the sense that you've got academic teams working, so you'll have deputy heads who work on the academic side, and then you've got myself, head of inclusion, who works at making sure that we've identified the right level of support and provision in place for when the child starts. And then you also usually have the head of EAL that works as well with the admissions. So usually what happens is you would register your interest in the school. We would invite you in to come and have a tour of the school so you can get a feeling for the ethos of the school, the environment, the resources that are available. And then from year 2 upwards, we usually run a CAP 4 assessment for our students, and that gives us a really good understanding of where the child's sitting at in terms of their capacity and capability and potential within the curriculum. It's also another really important thing for parents to understand is that that's not done, it's not used as a screening tool. It's the more information we can get, the better. So, I'll use a CAP 4 assessment. I will also use any kind of previous reports or references from the previous school. And then for the younger children, for FS students, FS1 and FS2, the students come in and do a stay and play, and they come into the classrooms and we do some observations with them. Now, when it comes to assessments, I usually meet the parents. So I'll invite the parents in for a meeting with me, and it's not even really a meeting, it's more a meet and greet where I get to know them. And I just ask them about the journey of their child. So where are they at? What experiences have they had before? What therapy have they got? And then, because in my school I've got like over 250 students on my SEND register, my brain starts to work and I start to think, okay, how can I fit this child into our school? What provision do we have that's going to meet this child's needs? So that's really the process. And then we would discuss what that looks like with the parents, and it's not something that's dictated by me. It's done in a joint conversation, where we really think about all the factors that affect that child's education and start in mainstream school. And then once we've decided that, then we offer the family, and they usually accept if they like our school, and then we get started on making sure that's in place. Now, for a family or a mum and dad who have a child that's neurodivergent, I think it's really important that you're forthcoming with all the information, because for a head of inclusion, you want to know everything you possibly can about the child. Please don't feel like because your child is neurodivergent, you need to hide anything from us. We want to make sure that the curriculum in school is accessible to all, and the best way to do that is to be honest and upfront in the beginning. And then I think that they would expect just lots of conversations. I, like some other heads of inclusion, might do some quite intense assessments of children. I prefer not to. I just usually really do some playing with them, some observations. I read their reports. But my main assessment is actually done with the parents and understanding exactly where that child is at their journey. And for me, it's not like a tick sheet. It wouldn't be like, okay, this child can do this, and this child is not yet able to do that, so I can't let them come into the school. It's more about, is it a good fit? Am I going to be able to do everything I possibly can to make school enjoyable and successful for that child and that family? That's just so very important.
So maybe let's run through, and I will ask you questions as a parent who would like to, have their child register in the school and is neurodivergent as well. Now, for the first question would be, what school should I be looking at? Because I'm not just looking at curriculum or academics at this point of time, but I'm also looking at my child getting the right kind of support, especially given the differences or different patterns of learning and understanding and processing my child has. So as being in the inclusive environment for so long, as a parent, what are some of the red flags and green flags that I should be looking when I am choosing schools to apply for?
Yeah. I think the green flag is going to be when you speak to the head of inclusion and ask that head of inclusion, okay, what does your department look like, and what is the structure of that department, and what provision do you have on offer? So, for example, if you were a parent asking me that, I would say that I'm the head of inclusion and I oversee the provision for all students with needs across the school from nursery to year 13. And then I have a structure of 4 SEN teachers who are responsible for different cohorts across all phases across the school. Underneath that, then I also have inclusion teaching assistants who offer push in interventions for the students or push out sometimes. And then we have a range of learning support assistants. What sits alongside that is that we're really looking, as a parent, you would want to be looking for some kind of specialist input. So some schools don't actually have the capacity, have in-house occupational therapy or speech and language therapy, but what you'd want to hear from a head of inclusion is that they collaborate with external clinics, that they're working with those clinics, because we know that our students need that specialist support, and the stronger the link is with the school, the better the outcome is for the student. So I would explain to the parent that we have in-house occupational therapy and specialist therapy, and then I would explain the range of interventions that we have on offer, because that's really the specialist offer, isn't it, over and above the curriculum. And then I would go on to explain the 3 different levels. So we have level 1 students, and what that means. So level 1 students are students that needs little adaptations or modifications within the classroom that can be coordinated by the class teacher. And then we have level 2 students who might need some extra therapy. So they have occupational therapy or speech and language therapy, ABA therapy, or they just access our academic interventions like Literacy Gold or Dynamo Maths. And then our level 3 students have a more complex diagnosis and often require a learning support assistant. And then I would explain what an educational, individual educational plan was and what that looks like for the parent. So really, I think that the question you've asked is really good for parents to know, that it's not actually only, and it shouldn't be, the parents being asked questions by the school, that the parents should be asking the school questions. And I think that through my experience of having conversations with lots of parents, sometimes I would say like a red flag is when you're looking at an inclusion department that's quite separate from the school. So when, the head of inclusion start, not to say that that's wrong, but if that, that's something, there's two different kind of models. There's the model where some schools have inclusion that are part more of mainstream, where you've got specialist staff going into classrooms and children are being taken out for little bits of time for intervention. But then there are other schools who have more of a push-out model where they've got students who are working in smaller groups and are being taught in that way. So it depends on what needs your child has. But when you hear a head of inclusion talking about the inclusion department as something very separate, I think that would be a massive red flag for me. And you want to hear that inclusion is a whole school responsibility, and that students who are neurodivergent are part of the community and they're being challenged and stretched, not only having their needs met.
Right. And that's so important, and I would second to what you're saying, because most of the time when I see parents going into school, and I always tell them, prepare your questions, because just as much the school wants to know about you and your child, I think you would also want to know a lot about, because it's not about is the school good or bad, or is the child ready or not. A lot of times it's just the fit,
exactly.
Right? Is this the right environment for my child? The school may be great, but may not be the right environment for your child at this point of time, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So that becomes very, very important. One other question as a parent would be, especially when we fill in this form to submit to schools, right? It asks if our child has additional needs, is going through any therapy, has a diagnosis. Now, often there are two things. One, maybe as a parent, I've never noticed any very significant challenge, or perhaps never had a diagnosis, never taken therapy, just getting along for the first time. Or two, still a bit unsure if, should the school know the complete diagnosis and therapy that my child has, because it might affect the possibility of my child getting into school. How would you, or what is that you would say to something like this? Do you think the opportunities come down because I'm applying not just as a regular, candidate getting into school, but I'm applying as a child with additional needs or neurodivergent getting into school? Does that reduce the opportunity for my child get into school as a parent?
I think that's a very, very important question, because I wouldn't say that it reduces the opportunity. I just think it delays the right support for the child. And I'm really glad that you've asked this question, because there is an element that's almost kind of missing within that journey or that process of students who are not yet identified, where parents might bring them in for a tour or an assessment, and then they might get flagged by the academic team. And I take this, and I speak about it quite often, I take this part of my role the most serious, I would say, out of everything. And that is because sometimes I'll sit in front of a family, a mom or a dad, or a mom and dad, and I would say to them, during my assessment or my time with your child, I have noticed that there might be something that we need to investigate. And I might be the first person that they ever hear that from. And that's a massive responsibility on my behalf, and making sure that I'm using some really, really good observation skills from my side. I've got a lot of experience, so I can pick up things quite quickly. And I think that, if it takes a lot of emotional intelligence for me to speak to families like that, because I've never met them. It's the first time I'm meeting them. So I think for parents, they need to understand that as well, in the sense that sometimes it comes from a place of making sure that we are getting the right support in place for the child. Okay. To a degree, if you had to enroll your child as a child that you have not declared that they have needs, what's going to happen for that child, I think, is not fair on the child. So, for example, if you knew that your child had a diagnosis and you didn't let the school know, your child starts FS2, first few weeks are really tough for that child for a number of reasons. I won't go into detail. But then it starts to form quite negative relationships, I think, with the school, in the sense that you haven't been upfront and honest. And eventually, myself as head of inclusion, I would be sitting down and I would be asking you a lot of questions, like, for example, is there a previous diagnosis? Have you been to see a neurodevelopmental pediatrician? Talk to me about the birth, about the milestones. All of those questions will be asked by myself. And when the truth finally comes out, for that child, if we had been honest from the start or forthcoming at the start, that first few weeks of FS2 would have been a very different experience for that child. So it's not that the child loses out on opportunities, it's making sure that your relationships are positive with the school and that the child has the best possible start. And there are a lot of school places opening up for students of determination, because the KHDA have done a lot of work on making sure that they raise that percentage that is required in the school. And even myself, like alone, and in my school, we're reaching up to 15%. I know the school that we're in right now is at 15%. So there has been a lot of work around identifying and enrolling more students of determination, because we're at that point where we can be more inclusive, because we've got all our systems set in place.
Which is wonderful. Like you rightly said, I think it's important to be open equally on both sides to make sure you get the right support for your child and the starting goes in well. However, as a parent, again, I have two concerns about this, right? The first thing is, for some reason, we've also seen that although, like you said, KHD has done a wonderful work with increasing the percentage of seats which are allocated for children who have additional needs, just to make sure they're able to support them in the right way, despite which we somehow see that there's still a shortage of these admissions that children have. So sometimes for parents, it's just about let him start school, just let it get started. At least the admission is done, and then we will deal with it in, finding out what kind of supports he needs. But if not, the whole process is completely blocked because this child has a diagnosis or because this child has an additional need. So sometimes I think it goes in the interest of not wanting to hide from the school or harm the child, but perhaps that at least allow the child to get into school, and then somehow let's figure out what can happen around it. So that's one of the things which parents have had or have expressed when we've had conversations about this. And the second thing being that, what do we do when all the schools have rejected? Let's say I've applied and they've said, oh no, there's a waiting list going on. Of course, genuinely, they do not have more than what they can, because like you said, maybe from your point of view, if I cannot support your child, it's injustice for me to just take in and not let them thrive in my school for the rest. So how do we balance out that situation wherein parents, have these rejections from many schools and end up asking, what do we do now? My child doesn't have a school year to attend.
I think, KHDA brought in a non-admission form for heads of inclusion, and we have to complete that non-admission form if we are saying to families that we don't have a space in our school. And I think that formal non-admissions form is going to open up more places for students. So that's really positive from a policy perspective. I think that it's important for parents to note that when we're looking for schools, especially in a place like Dubai, It's very popular. There are a lot of schools that are very good, and people want to get into those schools. And I think that some parents will come and want to enroll their students, so they'll come and meet me in June, and they want to enroll their students for August. And I think that the sooner the parents enroll their child, the better. Right. Because when it comes to our waiting list, how they work is, so for example, I've got 250 students on my register at the moment. I am waiting for all of those families to say whether or not they're staying or not staying for re-enrollment. And once that happens, then I'm able to offer spaces. So the waiting list is really there to replace those spaces as quickly as possible. But if you are coming 2 months before you want your child to attend school, it's very unlikely that we're going to have a space, which is unfortunate. But my advice to parents would be is go a year before. So make sure you're visiting a school a year earlier, right, and get your child on that waiting list. So, for example, my waiting list is only around 10 students. And for that reason, I'm able to offer those spaces really quickly at this time. But it would be really hard for me to offer a space to a family who's just come in at that point in time. I understand that there are lots of families in Dubai who face this exact challenge. And what I would really urge them to do is to have a look at school readiness programs while the students are waiting to get into a school. As a head of inclusion, I would never turn away a family without giving them other options. So just making sure that if schools are coming back and saying to families, we don't have a place, we'll put your child on the waiting list, ask questions like, how long is the waiting list? How many students? When do I expect to hear if my child's got in? What other options are there for my child? So that head of inclusion should be able to signpost the family to other schools or school readiness programs. So I think that would be my advice.
Yeah. Definitely. It really helps, for most parents to get that information handy before they take a call. You did mention in your conversation that the waiting list works as a first come, first serve basis, which means, let's say if I was the first to have applied, then perhaps my child would have had the opportunity to get into compared to somebody who's down the waiting list. Now, when schools also look into this, do they consider the level also as a factor?
Yes, like the level of need.
Yes. So let's say if I'm first on the waiting list, but my child is a level 3 support, and there's somebody who's 10th on the waiting list, but their child is only level 1 support. So do you think there's a differentiation in, the way the admission process works for the child?
Different levels. I think there's differentiation in the sense that, like we mentioned earlier, if as a school I'm not able to meet your child's needs, then I will be open and honest, and then you can either go away and do the school readiness program and come back, and then we would be able to place you on the waiting list. But I think it depends year by year. So it could be, we look at capacity per year group. So there are a certain amount of level 1s, 2s and 3s. And to be honest, we're trying to change that approach at the moment because we should be looking more at need or diagnosis or barriers as opposed to level 1, 2 and 3, because level 2 ADHD, a child with ADHD might look a bit different to a child with dyslexia. So we're looking at it in that way because level 2 is quite a generalization, or level 3. So I'd say it's very individualized to the year group, to the child, and what we have capacity for that.
So there are many factors that get considered during the admission process, right? And for many parents, these interviews, again, could be the first time they're actually learning that your child might need a shadow teacher, or who's also called a learning support assistant, or an ILSA, which is the common terminology is used. So 2 questions for me is, one, on what basis usually do schools give this recommendation when they meet the family the first time? And 2, what is that as a parent that they should be aware of when during the interview they've been told that, potentially your child might have something come up, we'll let you know, but be ready to get an LSA in place?
Yeah. I think it might differ from school to school, but when it comes to myself and how I approach learning support assistants is If after my assessment, after my conversations and my observations of the child, if I believe that the child won't be safe by themselves, then I would, like as an independent learner in the mainstream, I would suggest the LSA. And that's important word to note is it's a suggestion and a recommendation. And the reason for that is that, for example, I might have seen that the child's not really yet able to follow instructions. They might be running out of the classroom. So the safety element is a big reason why we have learning support assistants, to make sure that the child remains safe and those around them, and they're able to access that environment. So it's got a lot to do with like sensory needs as well.
Right.
And then the second reason why I suggest or recommend an LSA is if a child is working almost two years below the age-related expectation, because when you're looking at the British curriculum and the adaptations and modifications to that curriculum, a class teacher would only really be able to do that 2 years below. If a child is in year 5 as their chronological age, but they're working at a year 2 level, we're going to need someone else supporting with that access to the curriculum. So those are the two main reasons why I would recommend LSAs. I'm not a fan of LSAs in the sense that I want my students to be independent, but there is a place and time for when we need that one-on-one support. So that would be my recommendation. If parents are receiving that recommendation from a head of inclusion or a school, you're going to want to ask questions like, is the LSA internal, external? Am I allowed to choose the LSA? Can I be part of that interviewing and recruitment process? As well as, what are your reasons for suggesting this, and what is your pathway or your plan for my child on that LSA? Because sometimes parents, when they're only receiving that news for the first time, they might think that that's something that they will need for their whole schooling career, and that can be really overwhelming for a family. So definitely asking those questions, because it's going to impact your life as a parent for sure.
Right. And how important do you think it is for these families and the school in which the child is in to continue working with, like you said, external or sometimes internal, additional providers, which means, let's say, how important it is for them to collaborate with their medical team, be it their therapists, doctors, physicians or specialists who are involved with them, to bridge that gap between, the three environments predominantly where the child spends a lot of learning time.
So that's essentially the role of a head of inclusion, isn't it? Is making sure that all of the stakeholders, all the team that work around that child are coming together. Because the last thing you want is a speech and language therapist, an occupational therapist, and a SEN teacher and an LSA all to be working on separate targets. If that's the case, then you've got a child who's working on 25 targets at any given time, and that's really overwhelming for the child. And we know that therapy or any kind of external specialist support does not work best in isolation. It's best when we're able to bring that generalization of the child's everyday life into therapy. So this is actually called a team around the child meeting. And so the head of inclusion or the SEN teacher would be making sure that they facilitate those meetings regularly and as part of the IEP process. So when you're reviewing those IEP targets, you're reaching out to the therapists that work with that child to get an update on the progress. And then together you are writing the targets that are going to be, that the child will be working on for the next term. And we really like to, as much as we can, bring in all those stakeholders to the IEP meeting, because that just creates a consistency for the child and collaboration. So as a school, I feel really proud because we were really lucky. We built the Inclusion Hub not long ago. And in that Inclusion Hub, we created 2 intervention spaces for our external therapists, because what we don't want is a feeling or an environment where external therapists are not welcome in the school, that the children actually have to go out for that therapy. So why not create spaces within schools where external therapists can come and work in the school, see the child in their classroom, meet the teachers, especially for therapists, I think that teacher-therapist relationship is so important. And I know that the teachers really appreciate, like, for example, our internal occupational therapists and speech and language therapists, when they finished a session with the child, then they drop the child off back to class, and then they give them a little bit of a feedback. And I think that they really appreciate that, because then they can make those little tweaks along the way.
True. And like you rightly said, I think there's a huge shift in perspective of how care can be provided when you have this team from the medical or non-educational side collaborate with the educational side as well, which makes a huge difference for the family and for the child as well in their learning journey, which is amazing. The other question as a parent would be, okay, I've come for the interview, luckily I've enrolled earlier, so I have an opportunity to get into school. I'm willing to get an LSA to make sure my child is safe, learning, thriving, and has an adult. But for how long do you think I would need the LSA? Is it something that you can predict in terms of just for us to understand, maybe preparing ourselves, or maybe financial allocations I need to put through to know for how long? Because most of the time, there are, I would say, myths maybe that once your child has an LSA, the school would continue to ask for LSA because it's lesser work for the teachers and the staff as well. So as a parent, what is that I should be asking for in terms of that?
Yeah, very good question. I think, and we touched on that a little bit earlier, I think if I was a parent, I would be asking how regularly do you review the LSA support? So an outstanding school would be reviewing that LSA support termly. Some schools do it yearly, but we need to recognize that students, when they have intensive support, they can make accelerated progress. And there should be no reason why a child should have that support in place if they've reached that level of independence that we require, or they've closed those gaps that they needed to on the curriculum. So it was, I think, about 2 years ago, we started to change our IEP review process to include LSA support reviews. So do we feel like that child needs to reduce to 50%, or if the child's on 50%, can we move that child off completely? So ask for how regularly they review that support. And I think it can be a bit difficult for a head of inclusion to tell you exactly how long it would be. But I think if you've got policy in the school where they're reviewing it regularly, and you're in that meeting reviewing it, and you've got your voice as a parent, I think that's very important. But usually when I'm recommending it, I'll say at least for the first term, and then let's have a look at what we would like to do after that.
Right. And in terms of, you said the parent being a part of it. So as a parent, how often will I be involved in meeting the teacher, meeting the LSA, if in case it's an internal provider, the inclusion team? So how often will I be coming back to discuss and understand how my child is thriving?
Yeah, as a parent with the child who's level 3, who has an IEP, you will be at school a lot, which is really nice, I think. And you get a sense of community there, because having these regular meetings to discuss your child's progress is going to just make those relationships really strong, and it's really good for your child. So when we're talking about a level 3 child in our school, they would have the usual parent-teacher meetings every term, so they would get 3 of those with the class teacher. And then we would have 3 IEP reviews. So every term we review the IEP, write the new one for the following term. So then you would have 3 meetings with the team around the child, meetings with all the stakeholders, the class teacher, the SEN specialist teacher, the LSA, and any therapist working. So that's a total of 6. And then we have an open door policy. So if you are, and we do like to do things more face-to-face and on the phone or online. So if you do feel like there's something you want to chat to us about, you just have to email us and you can come and meet us.
Right.
It's the same for us. If we recognize that there's something that we need to celebrate, or there's a concern, we call parents in and we discuss straight away. That's so very important. But
Lovely.
Regularly, you would just, if you're looking at a usual year, you would have at least 6 meetings, and then hopefully attend the parent workshops as well.
So that's quite a bit of hop in, hop out, which is great. Like you said, I think it kind of creates that sense of belonging, even for the parent to understand what the child is going through. you did mention about IEP. So for those of them who are not very familiar with the term, it's an individualized education program which caters to the differences your child might have in learning. Now, as a parent, am I allowed to ask for certain things in the IEP? And a lot of times as a parent, I might also, share this IEP with the developmental pediatrician my child is working with and ask them to run through, because they take care of their treatment plan or support plans from the therapy and the other parts as well. So, and can they also have suggestions in terms of, why don't you add this into their education learning plan so it integrates the therapy plan and that's also generalized into education and vice versa. So is that something as a parent I can request schools?
You shouldn't really have to request it. It should be done naturally, really, because I would say that that's definitely a requirement of an individual education plan. First of all, it's a working document, so it should be adjusted when different stakeholders would like to add more information or feel like there's a target that the child needs to work on. So it's not, I don't want parents to see it as a document that's written at the beginning of term 1. We work on those targets for 12 weeks and then nothing can be changed. It's a working document. So if all of a sudden, you've noticed that your child really needs some support with tying their shoelaces, tell the teacher and get it on the IEP. Because everyone working with that child can be working on that target. And we know that it takes a village to raise a child, not just one person. So whatever we can do to help, it's important that we just share that information.
Right.
And when it comes to the IEPs, for sure, any specialist working with the child has definitely got a place for input as well as the parents.
Right. And as a developmental pediatrician myself, I do see how the child's learning behavior, the regulation is so different when I see them in the clinic versus when I see them in any other social environment or school, for example, or a classroom. And often we do find it, incredibly important for us to have an observation in the classroom setting, especially for children who have newly stepped into school or have gone into a different grade or have gone through a period of being dysregulated, changes in behavior, to understand what's happening in the environment, which potentially may be overwhelming this child when all other medical aspects have been taken care of. What would you say in that perspective? How important do you think it is for us to step in and, understand holistically what's happening for the child so that we're able to make better decisions in their therapy plans and home plans and school plans?
Yeah. We, as a school, encourage our neurodevelopmental pediatricians or educational psychologists to come into school and do those observations, because exactly for that reason, that you might see a different child in a classroom setting to, the therapy center or the clinic. You also need to recognize, I guess, that all schools are different. Like some schools might have more adults working in the classroom who are able to support, or the access looks a bit different. So having that in-person, in-school observation is key for sure.
Right. Okay. What does success actually look like for a neurodivergent child?
Oh, wow. That's going to take me a while to describe. But I think if I had to put it in a nutshell, success looks like, for a neurodivergent child, a happy child, a child that belongs, a child that can relate to those around them, and a child who is making progress no matter what that progress looks like, as long as they're making progress. A child that's really happy to come to school. I think that's the most important, that they, when they're coming into school, they feel happy and they have that sense of belonging.
Amazing. And we always, as medical students used to learn that a happy brain learns. So
Exactly.
I think that's pretty much summing up what that would mean. Does inclusion always mean mainstream schooling?
No, I don't think so. I think that when you're looking at inclusion really is making sure that you are giving access to anything for everyone. That's what inclusion is it not? So it can be sports day, it can be the school trip, it can be the night away on a school trip. So when we're looking at inclusion, it's looking at accessibility to any environment or activity or a community.
Right. And for some children, let's say, we feel despite them getting all the right kind of support in school, the child for some reason is not thriving because maybe that's just not the right environment fit in for their brain to process or understand. In such situations, how do you communicate with parents to tell them that, this may not be the right environment for your child, and what are the options that you would suggest to them?
Yeah, I've had this conversation, and I've actually got a great success story where I had that exact scenario where a child had all the right supports in place but just was not making the progress that we would have expected. And I think it's really down to the environment. When you go into these schools, these international private schools in Dubai, they are very big. They are big, they can be quite overwhelming, they can be stimulating, and like you say, sometimes that environment is just not the right environment for the child to learn. It can be too overwhelming. So I would never ever suggest that a child moves unless I was 100% sure that the place that they were going at would be the right place for them, or I would try to adjust their provision even more in school to make sure that they make that progress. But I would always have those places available. We do have in Dubai, we're really lucky. We've got loads of really good centres, smaller schools, specialist schools, who all have that kind of more calming environment, less stimulating environment where children can learn. Some of our mainstream schools actually have some really good, smaller settings within the school that can be recommended.
Right. And what is your opinion about homeschooling now that we're seeing a large increase in, the number of families who've chosen homeschooling versus the regular mainstream schooling and inclusive education? What's your opinion on that?
I think, again, it depends on the child and what that child needs, because if you've got a child who is really struggling with social skills or social communication, having them online, working at home alone, if they're an only child, is not going to be the best scenario for that child. But if that was something that you wanted to opt in for your child, in that case, then you would want to be looking at some kind of hybrid situation where, for example, the child could do the home learning but then also be part of some different kind of centres like Louise Dawson. I know she has a great centre where students can go and they can socialise with other students and do some activities. So you want to look at a child holistically. Yes, they can do their education online on a screen, but what about the other parts of them that we need to make sure we're developing as well? So
it's actually a lot more work because you have to fulfill every role that a school otherwise does, socially, extracurricular and learning and XYZ. That's wonderful. With the recent geopolitical situation, we've had 2 episodes where schools had to switch back and forth to distant learning. And of course, it's not easy for children and families, especially with children who are neurodivergent and their needs are different, especially level 3 children, like you said, who've had a lot of support set around them in school. And now the environment's suddenly swapped to being at home, online, with no support around them. So can you tell us a little more about how the situation was for you guys?
Yeah, I think the children that benefited the most out of that situation would have been the students that had external LSAs. And I think the reason was because our external LSAs could then go into the home and support the students in the home. So there was that consistency. They were able to access, their teams' lessons with their mainstream teachers. So that was really successful. I think you're going to, what we experienced was ensuring that our staff were really tech savvy. They all had laptops. I mean, our school is fantastic in that sense that they provide laptops to all LSAs or TAs. So there is that accessibility for staff to be able to work from home to support students. And then I think the biggest kind of challenge was that we just needed the trust of the parents. So we had to send our consent forms for interventions to go ahead as usual, but it would just be on a Teams link. And parents came back and they signed those consent forms. So I guess when I look back at that distance learning time, we were really blessed in the sense that we had everything that we needed to be successful. But there are situations or some schools that weren't in that position where they didn't have that technology or they didn't have the staff that were trained, but they quickly solved those problems. I think obviously in order to deliver effective online learning, you've got to have the right machines, you've got to have the right staff with the right skills. And what we try to do is we just try to replicate exactly what that child would have experienced in their timetable in school, but we just moved it online. We've also been progressive in the sense that when we were looking at our interventions years ago, when we were revamping them and buying in new ones, we went with the ones that were online because we just felt that, you never know. There might be a time when we would go online. So the children were able to access those online interventions as well, which was really successful.
Amazing. And I think just like how the country stood incredibly resilient and, won everybody's hearts in the way it's really catered to and supported. And I think it in small bits applies to every other aspect as well, like educational systems, schools. We've come out being more resilient, being able to figure out what are the alternative pathways that can be established, and now possibly more prepared that if at all, there's any situation where distant learning has to come up, or even for the benefit, I think we're more equipped and ready for handling that.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with you. This country has been absolutely phenomenal in keeping us safe in a situation. So thank you to them for that.
Yeah. What about AI? That's another very, very important aspect in today's world. What parts of AI has been inculcated into school models, especially, be it for teachers, be it for policies and pathway making, IEPs, tracking progress of the child, or therapy, or any kind of a educational plan and program? What is that AI has helped us in the school and education system?
I think we're fairly quite new on the AI journey, in the sense that when you're looking at education, you've got to be really careful around AI and making sure that it's being used responsibly and you're using the right platforms for it. It definitely has a place in terms of teacher workload, administrative workload. So I think that teachers want to teach. That's what they want to be doing. And sometimes our role can be heavily burdened by administration. So I know that teachers have been using that a lot in supporting them. So almost like an AI PA, who's working alongside them, completing those tasks that don't require such skill as teaching would. So they're able to direct their energy to teaching, which is a lot better. But I know that the education sector are doing a lot more work around AI and how we can use AI more for our students. The students love AI. They absolutely love it. And what a time to be alive, to be part of that. It's so exciting. But it's just, I guess, every school's different, but it's making sure. AI is fantastic. Like 2 of our interventions that we use, actually the students would do an assessment, and it really builds a program of intervention around that assessment that is so personalized and individualized. So I guess it's also making sure that we keep that balance between making sure that we're teaching skills to use those analytical skills that are so very important for as being part of a human, but then also using it to make our lives a lot easier so we can do all the fun thinking stuff. Yeah.
So you did mention about as a parent, if I were to look for a school for my child, it's important that I speak to the head of inclusion and have a couple of questions ready. But even before I reach to that stage, let's say I'm just choosing to apply for schools, what would you say are some of the realistic aspects I should be looking at? Would you say parents do look at rankings, academics, reputations and goals that they've had, social pressures, but what about things like the emotional safety, the regulation support, the sensory-friendly atmosphere they're providing, the flexibility, the collaborative culture? As a parent, how would I know this information even before I pick, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other schools that I'd like to even, go ahead and give a try?
I think as a parent, you would want to look at the website on the website, you're going to find a lot of information, and especially if you look for any kind of inspection report. So you look at the latest KHDA report, you're going to find a lot of information in that report about well-being and inclusion, because those are two parts of the inspection framework that have a heavy kind of focus when the KHDA comes in, because obviously they recognize the importance of well-being and inclusion. So, excuse me, read through the inspection reports and then do a tour.
Right.
I think before you book any meetings or make any commitments to any school, just give the school a call and book a tour. And when you're walking around the school, look at the children, look at the teachers, and you will get a really good feeling of what that school is like, being in that school for those teachers and those students. And then the third part is really by word of mouth, isn't it? So basically, I'm sure if WhatsApp, I mean, like there are loads of WhatsApp groups on there. So just ask in the WhatsApp groups. Parents are always going to be honest with you. They will always tell you their experiences in schools. Yeah.
Right. So as a parent, what should I be prepared for, and what should I prepare my child for before we come in for an interview?
I think that you would want to prepare a list of questions that you want to ask the head of inclusion. That's going to be really important. And make sure you have all the documents available. So any reports that your child might have received, or any contact details of therapists or professionals or medical professionals that your child's working with. Be prepared that your child is going to be meeting a lot of new faces. If your child does have some complex needs and requires a lot of prompting or preparing for any kind of visit, you can also ask the admissions team to get a social story for the school so that they are prepared for what the school looks like. So are you going to be experiencing, a big environment, especially if you've just come from a nursery school?
Yeah.
It's going to be a lot bigger. You'll be doing a lot of walking around, lots of chatting to different professionals and teachers. And then your child would just need to be prepared, I guess, for meeting some new people, being in a classroom possibly, and also being asked questions. And I think if you're looking at FS1 and FS2, toilet training and self-independent skills are going to be ones where you're going to be asked a lot of questions, because schools want to know, is the child toilet trained? Are they independent in feeding? Are they able to dress themselves? Those kind of questions. And that's not just a set of questions we ask neurodivergent students. It's for all students.
All students, right.
Because we just need to know what their independence level is before they come into the school.
Right. And is there anything from an academic perspective parents should be preparing their child to before they come in for their FS admissions?
No, I don't think so. I think that, you want your child to be natural. And if they've learned those skills and that knowledge in their nursery setting or naturally at home, they'll be able to share that. Because usually what happens, and especially in early years, which we mentioned a bit earlier in the chat, was that the academic team will do a little bit of an assessment where they'll find out, like, does the child know their colors? Do they know their numbers? Do they know their sounds in terms of like the alphabet and their phonics? Can they write their name? So those kind of like general school readiness questions are going to be asked for sure. And I'm sure we could probably give a link to parents so that they can see what those look like, what schools look out for. But I think you would want your child to be as natural as possible.
Right, right. And one another thing which we often see is most of these admissions, like we said, are for primary, right? And as a parent, what is that I should be also looking for if I'm looking at a long term with the school in terms of secondary, because it's equally or sometimes more important to understand that transition. So
absolutely,
what is that as a parent I should be looking at?
So as a parent, you are going to be wanting to ask whoever you're talking to, and they should be able to give you the answer, if it's the admission team or your academic team or inclusion team, what the pathways look like for secondary. Because when it comes to primary school, usually you would have students accessing the mainstream curriculum. Then they would have those added on specialist interventions that we spoke about. But when the children, you're going to want to ask what the transition is. First of all, what that looks like from primary to secondary if they're through school, how they facilitate that, how they prepare the students for secondary. And then when the students join the secondary parts of the school for year 7, 8, and 9, the students would be accessing the curriculum as usual. What pathways start to form after year 9? Because we know that some students learn differently. So, like, for example, are there BTECs where students aren't going to be writing formal assessments like a GCSE? Are they going to have access to gaining similar qualifications through coursework as opposed to, the pressure of having to write an exam? And then in terms of like A-levels, does the school offer A-level pathways for students who are neurodivergent? What does that look like? So BTECs, if your child has some more complex needs, you're going to ask about ASDAN, which is a program that a lot of secondary schools have in place, which teaches the students skills and those very important life skills for independence and the journey to adulthood. And then always ask about after secondary. So, when it comes to the secondary inclusion team, do they have a really good plan in place for students where they plan out their pathway to life after school and what that looks like for students? Very, very important that you're looking at your child's whole journey, not just the primary, not just the early years. Ask from nursery or FS1 all the way up to year 13 and what that looks like.
Right. And until what age or what grade is an LSA allowed to support my child in school?
All the way through. It depends on the students in upper secondary, like in year 11, 12, and 13. We have maybe a few students who have that support, but they prefer that independence. But it depends on the child. Like, you can have an LSA working all the way up to year 13.
So my last question would be, what is the one thing which every parent of a child with additional needs or a neurodivergent child you wish truly understood?
That's a bit of a tough question. I think that it would be really great if all parents understood that when they walk into the school that we are responsible for all the students and all the adults in that building. And when we ask questions and we request documents, that we're on their side and we are there to help them to make sure that that child has the best possible start of their education. It's not that we are trying to find a way to keep the child out. We want the child in, but we want to make sure that it's done successfully.
Wow, that's really nice. So it's predominantly parents understanding that we are a team.
Absolutely.